Welcome back, boys and girls. Welcome back to the first episode of this series called Playing Around. In this series, I'm going to pick up one library or package that you can use with your React apps, and we are going to dig into it. We're going to just play around with it, and we are just going to explore it together. Many of these libraries are going to be things that I have not used before. I'll just dig into the documentations, distill it down for you, and we can go through them together. So if you like that, stay subscribed and you'll see more of that coming soon. Today is the first episode and we will talk about React-dnd, React drag and drop. So what is React-dnd? React-dnd is a higher order abstractions over all the D&D methods that can happen in the browser. And this is made as a higher order abstraction that stands on top of your real DOM, and it will turn all those D&D events regardless of the browser, regardless of browser compatibility, regardless of whatever. It will handle all of that. That's why it's a higher order abstraction, and supply simple specific APIs for you to use in your React apps. It supports different backend structures like touch and HTML5. So this is also important to understand that the way React-dnd interacts with the DOM can be changed, and we'll get into that in just a second. But it supports that you can support touch interactions on mobile devices or on mobile devices or whatever touch screens that you have, and can also support HTML5. But it depends which one you want to support, if you want to support both. Why you want to use React-dnd? Because simply because HTML5 drag and drop is quite inconsistent and it's being handled differently by different browsers, and you can Google that stuff and there is many people who are not very happy with it. But what's good about React-dnd is that it abstracts all of that away from you, and it will give you very simple APIs, basic hooks, that you can use in your React app, which is really cool. Although it's quite simple, it's actually very capable. So it's simple APIs, but it's actually really capable. Basically, you will tell it whatever function you want to run in your React app on drop, on drag, on whatever. And we get into the details, but before we do that, I think React-dnd has a lot of abstractions, a lot of concepts that I want to explain properly before we get into the code. And in my opinion, so far, I think this is kind of the best, and it's kind of the general use D&D in React. It's kind of the best way to get started with D&D. Again, this is for general use D&D that you can be very flexible with. There is another package called React-dnd Beautiful. I think this is made by Atlassian and specifically made for vertical lists. And it's very powerful, but it's quite specific. All right, good. So I want to start again from the basic structure of how React-dnd interacts with the DOM and how it interacts with React. And yeah, this is just, I'm trying to explain to you a couple of kind of like very abstract concepts that you need to understand before we jump into the code. We all know this, right? We have a DOM and we have React, and React interacts with the DOM via the VDOM. So when the VDOM changes, React does the diffing magic and changes, and that reflects on the DOM again. Now, what happens is that all the drag and drop events happen on the DOM side. And again, those drag and drop events are inconsistent. They're different from browser to browser and so on. So if you want to interact with them in React, things are going to get messy. And that's why we have React-dnd. So React-dnd stands in between React and the DOM. So React-dnd will actually interact with the DOM, and it will also interact with React. And I want to explain the ways in which React-dnd interacts with the DOM first, and then we can go again to see how React-dnd interacts with React. So what happens between React-dnd and the DOM is that we have different backend structures, like I just mentioned. So you can support HTML5 interactions, you can support touch interactions, and so on. And you get access to all the drag and drop events that happens in the DOM. And there's something called item types, which kind of tells React-dnd what is being dragged. I will explain that in a minute as well. And all of these things are being passed on with monitors. So there are, it's a monitor of what happens in the D&D events. Just keep these general thoughts in mind. We will jump into details in a second. At the same time, React-dnd is also talking and interacting with React itself through collectors and through drag sources and through drop targets. So what are the collectors? Are kind of functions that will turn whatever information that comes from the monitors into props that you can use in your React app. So the very, very basic structure and the very kind of the general overview is that you have your React-dnd in the middle, and you have a specific backend that supports specific type of D&D events. Those D&D events are being monitored by the monitor, by the React D&D monitor. And when these events happen, these monitors trigger different collecting functions, collectors, that will pass on props to your React component, and you can use that prop to do whatever you want. So that's the very, very general overview. Now, let's jump into more detail. So I want to zoom into what happens between React-dnd and the DOM. So I want to talk a bit about what are the backends. So there are 3 different backends at the moment. And the concept of having a backend is really, really powerful, because you can write your own implementation of a backend if you want to have different kind of support interaction between React-dnd and the DOM events. That is up to you, and that's why there is the concept of the backend. Right now, there are 3 backends. There you have HTML5, which is a general one which we will be using. You have the touch backend, in which you can support touch interactions, and you have the testing backend also, which I haven't really got into. But I'm guessing that is just where you can test all the interactions and test what happens and what your DOM is telling you and so on. The second abstraction here is something called item types. Now, for React-dnd to understand the different DOM elements that you want to drag and drop and where those elements can be dropped, the authors introduced this item type. So it's kind of the source of identity for all your D&D interactions. So you can declare one DOM element to be of item type card, and that will dictate where that DOM element could be dropped, in which case maybe it will be dropped only in a list, it wouldn't be dropped on an image, or wouldn't be dropped on a different other drop target. And this allows you to have many drop targets, maybe like 4 drop targets, but they all support different items. So you can drag a card, put it in a list, but when you can drag an image, put it on a gallery, for example. But you couldn't drag the card and put it in the gallery, because they are different item types, because the gallery will only accept the item type of an image. And they also specify, like I just mentioned, they specify what can be dropped on what, and they carry information about the item that's being dragged. I will show you that as well. But sometimes, for example, if you want to drag a component, you want to pass into that item some kind of a prop that comes from that component, which we'll be using that shortly. And that item prop that you just passed in, you can have access to it on the other end where you get that item, or where you get dropped, and you can use that prop to actually do other stuff. Now, what are monitors? So like I just mentioned, monitors are, they communicate to your components what's happening on the DOM side from the D&D events. So they are kind of a state. And I think if you go into the website, you can see that it's they mentioned that everything in React-dnd is done in Redux. So this is basically a context that's kind of like hovering over the DOM, and it's telling you, storing the state of the D&D events, and it's passing that on to you as a context. And you can use that context to do stuff, which we'll be doing, of course. So this is kind of the summary of what happens between React-dnd and the DOM. This is what it means when I say backends. This is what I mean when I say monitors and item types. Good, let's look at the other side. So on the other side, React-dnd gets all this information that's coming from the DOM, and it want to pass it on to React, to your components, basically. And the way it does that, basically by doing collectors. So what are collectors? They are functions that will take the input that comes from the monitor and collect props that will pass on to your component. So this is the way in which you can interpret what happens in your DOM. So you have the monitors passing on the context to React-dnd, and then your collectors are the functions that will use that state into the monitor and turn it into props that you can actually use in your React component. Again, everything will be clear when we start writing code. And then you have drag sources and drop targets. Your drag sources are simply your draggable components, and they have to have a type, and they might carry information as in a component prop or different information that you want to use. They carry information that you want to pass into the drop targets. The drop targets, again, they accept certain types only of draggable sources. Like I just mentioned, if you have a gallery, you can drag an image on that gallery, but you can't drag a task card on the gallery and so on. And actually, I think that's the end. Another thing I want to mention here is also your drop targets is where you trigger different functions when you have a certain type of item being dropped on that target and so on. So that is it for the theoretical or kind of the overview part of this video. Let's jump into the project and see what we can do when we use React-dnd and how the code looks like. All right, so what do we have here? Here I have a very, very simple setup. This is a Next.js app with Chakra UI components, and I have tasks here on this side, and I have some kind of done tasks. And the idea here is that when you kind of drag and drop these tasks from here to there, they should be moved across. So you can imagine this being a draggable component, a drag source, and this being a drop source. So you can drop target, sorry, and then you can move that from here to there. Okay, now the first thing you need to do, of course, is install React-dnd and install the backend. If you haven't, I have done that, of course. If you haven't, then you just npm I react-dnd, and then I think the other one is react-dnd-html5 and so on. And you just install that and make sure that you are ready to rock and roll. Now, the first thing we need to do is that, remember what I mentioned about the monitors? So the first thing you have to do here is wrap your pages, wrap your app in a provider that will give you all the interactions and will provide the monitors for you. And the way you do that is, I'm doing this based on Next.js. So I have the _app.js file, and I already have color mode provider, I already have theme provider from Chakra UI, and I already have all of these, but I'm just gonna add one more to them. And that is called the D&D provider. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna auto import this. So I'm gonna import D&D provider, and I will take that over there. Yep, so I am wrapping everything in that. Now that D&D provider will take a value, which is whatever backend you wanna use. And in this case, I'm gonna use a backend of the HTML5 backend. So I'm going to import that. So import backend, yep, from React-dnd HTML5 backend. So, okay, so what is happening here is I'm just providing that backend to the D&D provider and going through everything in my app. And yeah, that's how we get access to the monitors that do everything. So after you install, you have to wrap everything into your D&D provider. So these are the first steps. Okay, good. So now this is the page that we are looking at right now. So how is this being rendered is very simple. We have a task list, which is a piece of state. And the first state of the task list, the original state, is that I have an array full of objects, and inside these objects we have an ID, which is the random number, and we have status if it's work in progress, so it should be here, and later we will have a function that will turn that into done, and we have a category as well, which is being rendered there, and a title and details and so on. And the way I'm using these is that I am saying, okay, I'm taking that task list and I am mapping it. I'm only mapping the work in progress ones, and I'm mapping that into a task card component that uses these props. So yeah, just keep in mind that this task card component has an ID prop, a category, a title, and detail prop. And that task card component actually is quite simple. It's basically just using the props, whatever props you have. So props to title, props to category, and then using props to category to change the color here. It's really, really simple stuff. Okay. Good, but keep in mind that on this side, I am using a task list, but I'm filtering that for only the tasks that have a status of work in progress. On the other side, on the done task side, I'm doing exactly the same thing, but now I'm filtering for the status of done. So on this side, we are filtering for the work in progress task, and on this side, we are only showing the done task because there's nothing here. It's an empty array. Nothing gets rendered. Good. Now, at the same time, I also have this mark as done function. This function will just take an ID, and it will take that ID and magically return back the new task list with all the other tasks, and with that specific task with its own status being as done. The way it does that is basically just takes the task. So I already have I already have the ID, so I'm gonna filter the task list for that specific ID. So I'm getting an array which have only one element, that is the task, and then I'm gonna take that task, the element 0, which is my task, and I'm gonna turn the status into done, and then I'm gonna compose a new task list. So I'm gonna take the task list, I'm gonna filter the task list for all the IDs that don't include my ID, so that basically will take all the other tasks, and then I am going to concat this. I'm just gonna add to that the task that I just shifted into done. So you can see here I am getting the task that I want, and here I am shifting that task status into done, and here I am composing a new task list which will have that new task that we just created, and will also have all the other tasks that don't match that ID. Good? Good. Quite simple all the way. Good stuff. Now, let's go into our task card and see how we can turn this component into a draggable component. So because this is actually the first step. Now, to be able to do that, the first thing we need is we have to define different item types in our app. And just to show you a good practice of storing these kind of stuff, what I'll do is I'm actually going to make a folder called utils, a utilities folder, and inside that folder I am going to have items, items.js. And inside this file, I am simply just going to export very simple stuff. So I will export a const called item types, and this is just going to be an object that will have a card, and that card will go into card. So this is very simple. All I'm doing here is I'm saying that it's a very simple object that would have card, which goes back to card. So I'm going to use that to declare that my task card here is of type card, and you will see how that's going to happen when we start working with the hook that we will get from React-dnd. So that hook is called useDrag because this is a draggable component simply. So what will happen here is we will have a const. This is a basic hook, so nothing really too fancy here, but I'll explain what we get from it. So here we have use drag, and you auto import that. Thank you very much, VS Code. And this hook will take up a couple of things. First of all, it has to take an item. So you have to tell it what is the item going to be that you're passing on. So in this item object, we will pass, first of all, we have to pass the type. And that type will be item types, which we haven't imported yet, .card. So let's go and do that with .card. So let's import item type first. So let's do that somewhere here. It's okay. It's screaming at me because it doesn't know what item types are, but never mind. So we do item types and we import that from, let's go, boom, let's go outside. Just, where are we? We are in pages. Let's go outside to utils and let's import that from items. Okay, good. So again, if you open items, you see card corresponds to card. Card corresponds to card. Okay, and it's not because it's not the default import. We can just do this, or we can just change it into default. It doesn't really matter. It's all the same. Okay, good. Now, so we are now declaring this, the result. Keep in mind, we are declaring the result that will come from our use drag hook as an item type of card. Good. Now, what we get back from this hook is two things. One is an object that will contain all your extra props that you want to have. So I'm just gonna put a placeholder here. So these are the extra props. These are the extra props, and we will get those extra props from our collecting functions. Remember, the collecting functions will look at the monitor and will turn the monitor events into props, and we'll get into that in a second. But the second thing we will get also is a ref, and that ref is going to tell React-dnd that the result of this use drag hook is going to be attached to that specific component, that specific DOM element. So the way we use that is we basically just attach that drag ref into whatever we want to do. So we're just telling it now, if you have different divs into this component, so what is going to be draggable is the div that will have that ref equal drag. So now React-dnd knows that this DOM element is the draggable DOM element. Now, how do we get all these extra props? The way we do that is by doing a collect function. So if you do a collect function here, so what we'll have here is we will have the monitor. Yep, we will have the monitor, and that monitor is going to return for us a couple of things. So we will tell it things like, okay, return is dragging prop if your monitor is dragging is true. So what happens here is that monitor has a property that is called is dragging, and when this property is true, it's only true when this specific item is being dragged. Okay, so now what happens here is that our collecting function is going to talk to the monitor, and when monitor is dragging is true, is going to add is dragging prop into our component, which we can use here. And to show you what I mean by this, if we go into here, for example, and we can add opacity here, and we can say this, if there is dragging, then just put the opacity to 0.5, otherwise then put the opacity to 1. Okay, good. So that, if you look at here and if you try to drag this, you can see if it's dragging now, we change the opacity back there. And if I just highlight this back again, if I just comment this out, this won't happen anymore. So you can still drag it, but that doesn't change anything here. So what's happening here again is that the monitor is telling React-dnd that, hey, this item is being currently is dragging. And your collecting function is saying, okay, if there is dragging will be true as a prop only if the monitor tells me that this item is being dragged. So if you take this out like that, you can see that it's being changed in opacity and so on, which is really, really cool. Beautiful. Now, remember when I said here, if you go back to the main thing, that mark as done will take the ID. Now, I also not only want to be able to see the item, I also want to be able to see the ID as well. So I not only want to pass the item type, I also want to pass another property, because this is just an object. You can just pass whatever you want here, but the type is required. So because type is being used to know where this item can be dropped on. So the type is required, but you can pass whatever you want here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass something here called props._id. And in this, by doing this, what I'm doing is I'm not only carrying the item itself, but I'm also carrying the ID of that task. So this is the ID of this task, and this is the ID of that task, and so on. And this is extremely handy. You can think of this is that, okay, you're not only just holding the item itself and the type card, but you're also holding whatever you want to be holding from that component. So you can pass whatever props, you can pass whatever you want to pass from here as well. And again, this is simply just an object. You can pass whatever you want as long as you have the type there. Good. So now that we have finished this interaction where you can actually drag stuff, let's go into the done task area and try to figure out how to do the dropping interaction. To do that, let's go to box target. Okay, now again, it's very, very simple. Again, very simple abstraction. The way you turn this into a droppable target is by using another hook, which is called use drop hook. Use drop automatically imported. Love it. Good. Now it's gonna be the same structure again. What's gonna happen here is we already know the drill now, so I know that this is going to give me my my added props. So this is my added props that depend on whatever the monitor is telling me. And this is the ref, which is going to be drop. And directly, I'm just going to attach this to the box here, which is this green box right there. So I'm just going to attach this here. And again, this box will render all the children that we pass on to it. And you can see here that I am passing into that box target. I'm passing into the task list that is being filtered with done. Don't need this anymore. Thank you. Okay, good. So now we also know that this has to, because this is a use drop, so instead of having an item, it will take something called accept. And again, this is a required property. You need to tell it what kind of items are you accepting. And for this, we're going to do item types, and it's already being imported, which is beautiful, .card. So now we are telling React-dnd that this drop zone will only accept card components. Good. Awesome, actually. Okay. Now, again, it's the same drill. We will have a collecting function, and this collecting function will take the monitor, and we'll throw that monitor into a function that will return an object. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to add a prop called isOver, and that will only happen when the monitor tells me that something is actually over this. Yep, and when something will actually over this drop zone. So instead of this stupid stuff, I'm just going to change this into isOver. Good, beautiful, actually very beautiful. Now, if you see here, there's nothing happening right now because I'm not really using the isOver prop, but let's actually do that and use it. So what I will do is I'm going to change the background based on if isOver is true or not. So if it's true, again, this will look very silly, but it's okay, just something to illustrate it. And if it's true, make it green 500, and if it's not true, make it green 200 as it was. Okay, good. Now let's test this interaction. So if I drag this over here, you can see it's getting darker. And again, the way this is happening is because I am dragging this over this drop target, and monitor is telling, is turning isOver to true, which will turn isOver prop to true through the collecting function. And when isOver prop is true, we change this into green 500. It becomes darker like that. Now, when I drop it right now, nothing really happens, and this is not what we want. When we drop it, we want to be able to use that function that we declared here, which is called mark as done. Now, this function is actually in the main component here. Well, we can pass it on to, back into the task list based on different stuff, basically. But the way I'm gonna do it is I'm just gonna declare a context, and I'm gonna pass it on into the context itself. And it's also gonna be a good practice if you haven't used context before. So the way to do that is very simple. I am going to export export const card context. In this case, card context equals create context, which will come from React. Thank you very much. And what I will do is I'm simply going to export mark as done, and the initial value for it is null. It doesn't really matter at this point. Okay, that is good. And then I am going to actually, I already have the value of mark as done. So what I will do is I will just wrap everything here into card context.provider, and the value that I will pass in here is going to be an object which has mark as done on it, and I'll close that off and wrap everything into this right there. Okay, good. So now mark as done is being passed into all of that. But to be able to use it on the other side, I have to import it. And to do that, I will do use context. So here, let's do this const. It's going to be destructured object, and here it will be mark as done, and this will come from use context from React, and it will use the card context, and it's already being imported. I love it when VS Code is just importing stuff automatically like that. It's really, really cool. Now I have access to mark as done function. So what I will do here is I'm going to add a function that will only be triggered on drop event, and you can see this will only be triggered on the drop event. Again, it's very well named. The API design is really cool. So what we'll do here is on drop, what I will do is I'm going to take this function, and you can see this in the documentation. Of course, you have to go and read through the documentation, but you can see here the drop will take item and it will take the monitor. So, and this is very crucial for our use here because I want to get some information from that item. So what I will do is I'm going to call mark as done because I already have the item here. So I'm going to call mark as done with the item ID. And actually, before we do this, I'm just gonna show you. I want a console.log of item here. So I want to show you what happens. What is the item actually is. So if you go here, okay, something is wrong. Okay, take that away. Oopsie, sorry, my bad. That's just a colon. Save that. Yes, good. Now let me just resize this a little bit because I will have the console open here. Okay, cool. Now what will happen here is when I drop this over here, so if I drag this on top, this we already know this when it comes hover, and if I drop it, we are now console logging the item that we are getting, right? And again, the type is card and the ID is 68. If I drag this and drop it here, the type is card and the ID is 48. If I drag this here and it's a different ID and so on. I don't know why they are so close, but yeah, different IDs, okay? Now I just want to illustrate this even more. If I go back and comment this out and go back here and just drag and drop this, I'm just getting a card. And this is what I meant, that your item here is going to be the object that you pass into your drag and drop targets and your drag and drop interactions. So you can pass in whatever you want here. In this case, I'm passing the ID prop because that's what I'm going to be using to actually mark it as done. Okay, good. Let's go back to writing code. So here what we will do is we are going to call mark as done with the item.id. Okay, good. Let's test this and let's hope it works. So let's drag this out from here and put it here. Oh, bam. So now you moved it from a work in progress to done task. So drag this out from here, bam, move it there, and bam, you moved it here. And you could also program the work in progress tasks body here to be another drop zone and so on, but I'm not doing that at the moment. But yeah, this is basically playing around episode with React-dnd. I really, really recommend that you go and read this overview. It will explain what are the backends, what are the items and types, and why you use items and types. It'll explain what are the monitors, what are the connectors, and so on. I think this is kind of explaining the higher order components, which is a little bit older, but then you jump into the tutorial and it's absolutely beautiful. He, in this tutorial, it's actually quite high level, where he explains how to make a chess game, which is really cool. And this is the end result here. And he will test for whatever droppable zones, because it's a piece that only drops in separate zones and so on. It's really, really cool. So yeah, absolutely give that a read. Thank you very much for watching this episode. I really hope that you learned something. I really enjoyed diving into React-dnd. If you like this video, like it. If you dislike this video, dislike it as well. If you want to learn more about different random React packages and libraries, just hit the subscribe button and you will see more coming your way. Have a good day, boys.